Good evening and welcome to our latest in our professional development workshop series. I'm Cindy Lott. I'm your academic director and full-time faculty at the Nonprofit Management Master's Program at Columbia University School of Professional Studies. I am so excited to welcome Dr. Allie Webb, who's one of our newest adjunct faculty members teaching in our program, and she's put together a fantastic panel for you all this evening. As you know, some of you are very, very interested in the philanthropy side of the nonprofit work and all that we talk about here in the program. We have a number of classes that address the philanthropy side, as I call it. And Dr. Allie Webb is going to be teaching a new class, Strategic Philanthropy, that also addresses some of these issues. She has a long history in working with the foundation world, including many years at the Kellogg Foundation in Michigan. And she brings tonight actually a panel of folks in the Midwest, I will say, Kyle and Kara, and she'll do introductions there, who also come from different walks, different types of foundations, in order to talk tonight about what it's like to work within a foundation and how to think about your applications, how to think about how to frame, if you will, your experience and your shiny new MS nonprofit management degree. Some of you may also be alumni who are ready to do a shift in your field. And so tonight's panel is for you. I want to thank our panelists again this evening and encourage all of you to follow our social media because we have announcements of all sorts of different types of events and workshops coming up. And to welcome our very new graduates who will finish out their graduate career here in the next week. And we will see all of you at the alumni reunion, and welcome to the grads in July. You'll be seeing an announcement about that soon. So with this, I'm going to turn over the evening to Dr. Allie Webb. Welcome her to our program, to teaching and to doing these types of workshops, and our esteemed guests. Thank you all for your time. Enjoy this evening.
Thanks, Cindy. I really appreciate that. We're looking forward to a great discussion tonight, and so glad you could kick us off with a little description of what's going on at the program. I am Allie Webb, and as Cindy said, I am the newest adjunct faculty member at the school, and come out of a philanthropy background, 20 years in the nonprofit world and government, and lots of different activities. And we'll talk a little bit about how I ended up where I ended up. But I wanted to start tonight by introducing our panelists. Cindy told you that they are both from the Midwest, which is correct. And I'll start with Kara Carlisle, who is the Vice President for Programs at the McKnight Foundation in Minneapolis, St. Paul. But Kara and I met at the Kellogg Foundation, where we spent 8 lovely years together creating all kinds of mischief and trying to make our respective responsibilities, Kara in New Mexico and I in Michigan, a little better for vulnerable children. But what I really want, you can read Kara's bio. It's very interesting. She's got fascinating degrees. She has an MBA from Northwestern and a divinity degree from Claremont in California. And so it really gives you a little insight about some of the dualities of her personality. But she's creative, she's innovative, she's fierce. And she's mostly fierce about community participation and engagement. And you'll see in her bio maybe where that came from. She's actually a Midwesterner, transplant, born in abroad in Korea, and lived and was raised in Indianapolis. And so she's got a great story to tell. Kyle, my dear friend, I have known Kyle for the whole 20 years I was in Michigan. He has done all kinds of things. And the reason I asked him to be on the panel is because he really has been involved in a very full form of the nonprofit sector, both leading a nonprofit organization of organizations and now leading the Council of Michigan Foundations as their president and CEO. Kyle is really notable because of his kindness. He is both passionate and gentle, and one of the most persistent people you'll ever meet. Don't ever give Kyle an inch, because he'll be right there making you pay up. And And I think it's what has led him into these leadership positions. You've got to be persistent. So I'll let them tell their own stories. We want to start tonight. We'll talk. We will talk together as a panel, and then we'll open it up to your questions. There's a Q&A function on the in the Zoom box, and please write your questions down. And as they come in and appropriate for the flow of the conversation, I'll read them and we'll try to answer them. But I expect a lively conversation. Never been let down by this group before, so I think it's going to be a fun evening. But I really do want to start. I'll start with Kara. So how did you get to the Kellogg Foundation that cold winter day?
Right when in 2008, when the whole economic situation in the United States was collapsing.
Right.
First of all, thank you for the invitation, and thank you for those who have joined the call and for doing a Zoom call late in the afternoon. So appreciate the patience for all of you to be part of this conversation. So as Ali said, I'll just share a little bit of my background because it really is a pathway and shows how I ended up accidentally in philanthropy. Like many folks of the generation who are professionals now, philanthropy wasn't a word that I'd ever heard of. I had not thought about nonprofits actually. Even back in the 90s, nonprofit was sort of a new term. The sector wasn't something known to me. And in college, I didn't ever hear the word foundation. So it really wasn't on the map. But after college, I ended up going to school and studying philosophy and politics and ended up in California, Southern California, in part because I had been raised in a multiracial family in the Midwest, Black, Korean, and white. And as I grew up as an adult, I was not from an activist family, but I was from a predominantly white community, and growing up and becoming a young Asian woman in America, I realized I needed to understand what that was like and what people thought when they saw me. And so I ended up going to California, Southern California, for graduate school, and where I did a Master's of Divinity at Claremont, and about 20% of the students at that time were international Korean students working on PhDs. During that period of time, both college and then the first round of grad school, I was really drawn into really big thinkers that you would probably put in the category of popular education. And popular education movements meant you really listened and engaged with people in community, and you understood that the wisdom and the power of transformation was at the intersection of people's greatest pains and oftentimes their greatest joys. And so I really felt really compelled by that idea, and many thinkers, Gustavo Gutierrez is one who came out of Latin America, Paulo Freire, Bell Hooks, who many of you know, she's come up quite a bit again around All About Love is a really important book that she authored and is still really widely read. And it actually led me to the streets of Los Angeles. And so I ended up working and volunteering almost 20 hours a day during that period of time. And what I found was when I was there, this was late 90s, early 2000s, was really the aftermath of civic life that had been really catalyzed by what happened in 1992. Saigu, which means 429 in Korean. The community there of Korean immigrants, and Ali grew up in Southern California, so she would know this firsthand, had really seen themselves as an enclave of Koreans. But after 1992, when there was huge amounts of economic loss and cultural loss, there was this movement to say, never again, we need to actually claim and develop the American part of what it means to be Korean. And having come from the background that I came from, when I moved to Los Angeles and inside Koreatown, at the intersections of a historic African-American community, Jewish community, Korean community, and a largely Hispanic, Mexican, primarily Mexican population residentially, my life experience really began to come alive there, to say, how can you bridge across difference? And how can you actually strike a connection with people's deepest pains and their deepest sorrow, so that you actually can become, what I would say, sort of a transformed place. So I spent about 10 years doing this work, learning everything I could from really generous, big-hearted people, some kid that had moved from the Midwest and was embraced and ended up chairing these massive civic engagement experiments and ended up chairing the Human Relations Commission for the city of LA, which really looked at race issues across the whole city. I think that is really what drew the Kellogg Foundation to recruit me then when they had just launched a new program, this was back in 2008, to focus on civic engagement and to do a national portfolio around how do you support both learning about civic engagement and then how do you begin to fund that across the country, and then also how do you begin to think about racial equity, which were two new commitments. And at the time they talked about them as lenses or ways that you would look through your work and apply those two. And I would say Kellogg was really early in the recognition at that level, how important both of those would be to shaping community and community life. And so I share that a little bit because I got into this alley accidentally by doing what I loved and then finding a way back to apply what I'd learned in the Midwest, which was very different to have such a large foundation situated in the Midwest. And because I wasn't from the coast originally, I could actually make the transition into a different environment, which I think is sometimes hard if you've not been or grown up in or had deep connections to the Midwest, because it does feel different and change looks different and people talk differently. But that's a little bit of a sketch about how I ended up accidentally at the Kellogg Foundation in Michigan.
That's great, Kara. Thank you. I'm also accidental into philanthropy, and I'll share my story after Kyle tells us how he ended up at CMF and other points, Michigan.
Well, thanks, Allie, and thanks for everyone who's joined us this evening. And I want to thank the university for having us. And following Kara is awful hard, so I'm gonna endeavor to persevere her story. I've heard it a couple of times because we're friends, but it gets richer and richer every time, and I get more jealous about her great experiences. So I'm going to try to be eloquent, even though I'm starstruck at the moment. I am also an accidental child of philanthropy. My first career was actually in photography. I was a professional photographer. I was something I'd always grown up knowing full well that's what I wanted to do, and got into it and realized that I was good but not great, and was getting married, having about ready to start a family, and really thought there was something more that I wanted to do, and went back to grad school. And on a total lark, a professor of mine put a brochure on my desk and said, you really ought to apply for this government management internship program, just to see if there's some possibilities, because I had the exquisite timing to graduate in the middle of one of Michigan's recessions, and the job market was really tight. So I accidentally went into a blind interview with a number of agencies and got hired by this obscure little agency in state government called the Michigan Community Service Commission, and realized that I had stepped into the middle of the creation of the national service movement and the explosion of civic participation in the early 90s, and was on the job all of 3 months when President Clinton signed the National Service Trust Act, created AmeriCorps, and my job was to stand up AmeriCorps for Michigan with no playbook, no understanding of what national service was, including the feds not really knowing what it was yet, and a full open marketplace of nonprofits who are eager to find out what it means to have a core of young, aspiring, and all generational volunteers working in their organization. So I learned about the role of nonprofits and volunteers and civic participation and grassroots movements, and trying to mobilize a new field around civic participation. And it was a tremendous growing opportunity. And I was in the job all of another 4 months before I realized that I was actually working for the governor's wife. The first lady was the chair of the commission, and I had my head down doing the program, and all of a sudden we had our first board meeting, and there she was at the head of the table. So I learned that the role of a public grant maker and the interplay with politics and the role that public policy plays in advancing civic participation can be highly productive. I was running Bill Clinton's signature program, at that time considered a moderate blue dog Democrat, running working a program in the state for a governor who was considered the most conservative at that time in the landscape. So it taught me about how you can get above partisan politics so long as you can find shared values. And you can use that to make community change. And so that role as a public grant maker really set me on a whole new course that I hadn't expected. And it really started me into a career of understanding nonprofit organizations. I had run our state association of nonprofits. I had started a collaborative nonprofit to promote volunteers and merged that organization. I ended up running the State Service Commission for a number of years. And I ended up running a center on philanthropy where we taught what it means to understand this craft and trade that we're going to talk about today. All of that before coming to the Council of Michigan Foundation, which is one of the largest regional associations of grant makers in the country. And all of that experience was grounded in this notion that philanthropy is an important ecosystem that involves nonprofits, donors, volunteers, practitioners, and champions in the field, but it requires support. It doesn't happen on its own. So my career has actually been in the infrastructure space, those organizations that help nonprofits, foundations, volunteer organizations all do their work better. So my practitioner role has largely been in the advocacy space for our field and helping the various sectors, including business and government, understand the role of nonprofits and philanthropy. One of the things that I would just pick up on before I might tie off my story and turn it back to Allie is that the framing of this conversation about being mission driven and resource rich is an excellent framing, because the field that we're in really focuses on positive community change for the long haul. So a career in philanthropy is not one that you can lightly skip into or lightly skip out of. If you're in it and you're going to enjoy it and be passionate, the things that you're going to want to see change are going to take a long time. And so you have to invest really deeply yourself into the work. So the resource rich is not so much about money, but about the human capital and the ability of people to really dig in and want to see really meaningful work and be persistent. So I appreciated Allie's introduction about persistence. It usually used to mean that no one wanted to sit in a room with me and a program officer because I usually walked out with the check, which is how she used to describe me in my persistence, which I actually also enjoyed. But the idea of a career in philanthropy is something that you have to think about in terms of the change you want to see in the world and the role you want to play in that, and think about all of these things that both Kara and I have explained as the tools to do it. So I look forward to our conversation, and again, Allie, I appreciate this opportunity to share great stories with you and with Kara.
Thanks very much, both Kara and Kyle. You know, it's interesting. It's 20 minutes into our conversation, and Kyle was the first one to talk about money. And I know a lot of people can be attracted to foundations because they're in that position where they do have assets and they make those assets available to nonprofits to reach social change goals. But getting a job in a foundation, if you're motivated by giving away money, you're probably better to become a venture capitalist and start your own foundation than to follow the pathway that the three of us have followed, because giving away the money is really such a small part of the work. And that sounds really weird and people don't ever believe me. It's like, just write me a check. So we'll try to get into that a little bit. I mean, my story is pretty quick. I was working at the Nature Conservancy and we were making a pitch to the Kellogg Foundation. We wanted $2 million for a river restoration project in Peoria. And after we'd done our pitch, took a whole day, the vice president came up to me and said, have you ever thought about working at a foundation? And, seriously, I'm kind of like Kara. I thought it was what was under a house. I was in government. I didn't really know what a foundation was. And I said, he said, yeah, we're hiring at the Kellogg Foundation. And I said, oh, that's in Battle Creek, Michigan. Thank God I knew where it was located. That's a really important fact when you're asking people for money. He said, yeah. I said, well, I don't really know anyone who wants to move to Battle Creek, but send me the information and I'll circulate it among my network. Well, about 6 interviews later, I was the one moving to Battle Creek, where I spent 20 years. I had 7 or 8 different positions in the foundation. I ended up the last 5 or 6 years as the director of Michigan programs, but I started in communications because that was where my background, that was my expertise. And that's why I was hired. I was hired because I had government experience. I had deep communications experience, and that's what the foundation was looking for at that point. And they put me on the food systems and rural development unit, which was really funny because I, as Kara said, was born and raised in LA. My grandfather was a rancher and did grow walnuts and beef cattle and oranges, but that really didn't qualify me from a content point of view. But so my road was very circuitous to get to a foundation. And but I would want to talk a little bit to you if you're interested in a more direct route rather than meandering around the way I did. Do either of you have any advice for folks about what they should be thinking about as they're preparing or wanting to make this move? What should be top of mind for someone who wants to break into the foundation sector?
Sure.
Please, who?
You want to go, Kyle?
Sure, I'll take a swing. Well, I think that as you're thinking about this field, there's 3 things that I would quickly share. One is that remembering that philanthropy is an ecosystem. So it's, while you think about the foundation, you think about a role as a program officer or think about a program director role, it's really still not able to effectuate change on its own. A foundation needs nonprofits, it needs partners, it needs volunteers, it needs people on the ground doing the work. So back to Allie's point about giving away the money, that's the transactional part. That's actually the end of a long process of understanding community, understanding change and how you want to affect it. And that finding the right partner and the right strategies and developing the right structures to move capital to actually affect that change and to develop those partnerships is the craft of working in that ecosystem. So recognizing that it's an ecosystem, a foundation doesn't stand on its own. The other thing to think about, I think, is that it's a great opportunity, but it's with a broad range of ways to enter, but it is an elite system. In other words, there's a finite number of opportunities to get in philanthropy, so a direct route can sometimes be the hardest. So working in the sector more generally, or working through organizations that work with philanthropy, can be a great way to understand the work. And many of, I'm sure, the participants on this webinar understand that. What becomes more difficult to understand is that there, until recently, there really wasn't a career path that you could follow an education role that then leads into an automatic role into the sector. And even if there were, I think the journey is far more exciting. Our journeys that we've been sharing here the serpentine routes were the only routes that probably would have worked for us, because it gives us such a rounding opportunity to get into the field. So there's a lot of ways into the sector, but the roles themselves are finite. It's a very small field. So be ready to explore that journey. And then the third piece that I would just share is something that I've come to actually because of my partners on this webinar and their persistence with me, is I really didn't understand the role that equity played in philanthropy until I was well into it. You know, I'm a 27-year practitioner. I was probably 15 years in before I understood that inequity helped form philanthropy, right? The accumulation of wealth, and in the early stages of how we look at organized philanthropy, it really wasn't set up to be a change agent role. It was really a different way for those with great wealth to express their own points of view of the world. And that wealth was amassed in a certain way that was not necessarily good to all. As you think about the work that philanthropy does today, in order to deal with disparities and inequities, it becomes part of the work. It becomes central to your work. And you live in that dichotomy all the time, that you are helping those who have amassed great wealth distribute it in a way to alleviate inequities. And so you always stand in that tension. And you have to understand that then as you explore this field, equity cuts through everything. And it's only when you become a really deep engaged practitioner that you realize how it can manifest itself in your work. Otherwise, it becomes a transactional career, and I think less fulfilling. So understanding the ecosystem that you're in, understanding the finite roles with the great opportunities inward to it, and then understanding that equity is always at the center of your work would be the three things that I would just share.
Great. I love the serpentine route and that employment in an adjacent area is how I ended up in this field. Kara as well. And so, Carrie, we were talking a little bit about doing something else well before you get into a foundation. That's certainly your story. You were meteoric in your career there in Los Angeles. True story.
Maybe. Well, so I will say, and I'll build a little bit on what Kyle shared, but I think most of the folks on the call have done something in their life. So I understand that this is a very seasoned group of students. I think knowing what you love and are passionate about and what you can do well is really important. I've had a number of people say to me when they find out I'm in philanthropy that they want to do that at the end of their career. It would be a nice way to tie off and to give back. And I always wonder what it is that people's vision or assumptions are underneath philanthropy. And so what I'll share is a few different things that I've learned along the way, just to go behind the curtain a little bit. The first one is an analogy around government. So for many of you who have worked either within government or adjacent to government, or tried to call somebody to fix something in your community, you found pretty quickly that there are different layers of government who have very different functions and missions in terms of public service. So you don't really want to call your congressman to fix your pothole, to figure out your trash. You would probably go to your city council member. And if there's a hospital or a mental health issue or a health issue, you go to the county. Philanthropy, as Kai was mentioning before, is part of a very vast ecosystem. And philanthropy, I'll say two things. Philanthropy in my mind is sort of on a spectrum of immediate relief. So you have like Red Cross, who does very charitable direct relief. A lot of folks who are really active now during COVID that are really positioned to do disaster relief and recovery. So there's a whole field of expertise that does that on a global scale, very different model. Then you have on the other end of the spectrum what they would call root cause or systems change funders. And then there's every sort of thing in between. When I was a young grant writer, trying to figure out how to get the attention of big money, which I never did, by the way. So I've really tried to bring that experience into thinking about a funder, how you can connect with with those that are just so small or culturally based that nobody would really think they were sort of had enough capacity, which is an equity issue that Kyle had mentioned before, is that I had no clue what a different foundation did if they were a family foundation, which I'm working with now, a fourth generation family foundation, what it meant to be a community foundation, which has very different laws, very different abilities to think about policy and advocacy in a way that a private foundation does not, a corporate foundation, whether that's an independent foundation or whether it's part of, you know, the corporate social responsibility. So what governance model you walk into is really, really important. And I really just stumbled across Kellogg accidentally, and I didn't realize any of that before I started. And so as an outsider going into the field, I would really encourage people to take a look, actually go to Kyle's webpage and look at the variety of players or actors that are in philanthropy that are part of that system or ecosystem, because it'll help you understand where your passion and your skills may intersect. The other piece of advice I would give or offer is that, and again, building on an earlier point, when we think about money as one piece of it, the way that we talk about it at McKnight is around the toolkit. And the reason I went back to get my MBA about 10 years ago was that I realized that my tools needed to be expanded and sharpened. I knew how to do process. I was really steeped in pedagogies of convening, which I think is a really important part of what philanthropy can do to be of service, is actually bring unlikely people together. Because philanthropy, although everybody's trust in public institutions, including philanthropy, is really questionable right now in the environment we're in, there really is a really important responsibility that philanthropy plays to bring different actors together for public-private partnerships or other kinds of ideas or problem diagnosis, and then also problem, you know, trying to figure out how do you begin to address or solve a complicated or complex problem. But the toolkit has really changed even in the past 12 years since I've been in the field. Mission investing, impact investing, beginning to think about the movement to divest from fossil fuels, books, Kyle, you mentioned before around the field, the level of transparency and pressure and the level of critique of power has come out in lots of different places. Winners Take All is a really popular book by Anand Giridharadas. You've got Decolonizing Wealth. You have a whole bunch of other folks. And so I would just encourage, and my advice here would be, and then I'll shift, is really do your homework, really understand what are the tools that foundations are allowed to legally do, what are the tools that you can actually do to really be part of shaping that, and then really make some wise choices, and no more than I did going into philanthropy.
That's great, Kara. I appreciate all that. You know, it's so interesting to hear you guys talk about this, because we sound so thoughtful at this point in our careers after having been in philanthropy but I remember the best piece of advice I gave a new staff person who had joined the foundation, and Kara was there actually a little bit before I was okay, for the first 6 months, you're not going to understand anything people say because they're only going to talk in this weird coded language, and really get worried because after 6 months, you'll understand them. And there is a whole language, and Kara was saying, you've got to study up, you've got to know your target, you've got to understand where you want to go and then place yourself around that institution in order to be invited in. Yeah, it's an odd duck of a place. And I really like you guys to talk. I want, if anybody's got questions, you know, the floor is open. Please type them in. Would be glad to take this conversation in any direction that would be helpful to anybody in the audience. So please use your Q&A function there at the bottom of the Zoom screen to type your questions. So what should people not do if they want a job in philanthropy? What should they just avoid doing?
Kara, ladies first.
So what would we avoid doing? Hold on. I have activity in my home right now, so maybe
Okay.
I'm going to go on mute right now.
I'll go. So there's a couple of things that we've touched on that we would really all want to embrace fully, and part of it is our approach. And so thinking about this career, I think Kara said it best about, well, I think I'll do that when I've done my work life, and this will be the thing that I cruise and have fun with, which is true. It is a great career, but you know, having come from one profession, a highly technical one, to this one, this is the hardest work I've ever done. So it is, what I wouldn't do is assume that it's simple or assume that it's not complicated. It is complicated work, highly rewarding, highly impactful work if you have the patience and persistence to do it, but it is complicated. So never assume that it's the thing that you can do that is not frustrating, or that it won't in some way push you beyond what you thought was possible. It's hard and complicated work. So don't underestimate it. The other thing, which I would say is a no, is don't rush into what looks like a great opportunity without understanding what the real work is and what the culture of the institution is. Because the work that you will do in philanthropy is so personal, and it's so, as we said early on, mission driven. You really have to invest yourself personally in it. I'll say that Allie and I have been in rooms where we've had to have really, really tough, hard, passionate conversation with our peers that they were just hard, really hard, but they were absolutely necessary to get at the core of the work that we want to do. And sometimes we were speaking to power. Sometimes we were, you know, folks outside of even our domain, because the work is very values driven. And so if you're gonna get into this field and get into the work and really drive it well, you're going to invest a lot of yourself into this. And so the mission, the organizational culture, the way that the institution solves problems needs to align with the way you feel are important and you will value, because otherwise the struggle will be both internal and the work. And I think that's something that's unique to philanthropy, because they are mission driven. And the last thing I'll say is don't try to program it. I know this is the worst advice to give to a graduate program, so I'm just going to say it up front. Enjoy the journey and just get lost in it. But if you run a roadmap, it's a very hard field to go from point A to B to C to D to E. But if you can find an entry point and then just explore the field and explore the work, you may end up at several organizations, you may end up at one organization, but to try to do a roadmap is really difficult. But to understand what you want to get out of your journey and the things that you want to learn and explore, that's the vocation. That's the career path.
I love that. We've got 3 questions here, so let me throw those on the table, Kara and Kyle, and you can answer the advice, the don't question, or any of these 3. Can you get a job in philanthropy without a master's or a PhD? Interesting. Yes, I had a master's and got a PhD. So that's one. Would like to hear about a typical work day or one of your most favorite projects that you worked on during your career, or memorable moments. And then the third one this is from someone who's currently working in fundraising and has some familiarity with being a grant seeker. So can you have some recommendations about how to make the transition from grant seeker to grant maker? So
I'll take
open on any of those.
I'll take the last one. Kara, do you want to take one of the first 2?
Sure. So I'll say, this will go back to my earlier comment, that the field of philanthropy is evolving and transforming, and the ideas of equity have really been penetrating a lot of traditional thinking within philanthropy, where there are a lot of folks who recognize the tension or the paradox of power that's inherent in the way philanthropy has been, in many cases, an extractive, whether it's human capital or resource extraction, that has actually led to amassing wealth And so there has been a real deep, I think, exploration within philanthropy to say, how can we be more inclusive, less elitist? And so a lot of foundations have been, and Kellogg did this, and the same thing at McKnight. We've actually changed the way that we recruit and said, and many, many foundations are doing this, what we want is an equivalent experience. You don't have to have an advanced degree. It depends also on the size of the foundation and the type of foundation. So if you have a lot of different varieties of roles, you can enter in to like a manager level, which is sort of, so there are different entry points. And so I would just say, yes, it depends on the type of foundation, but I do think that there's been a real positive move in that direction to value more than just sort of a credential of a traditional degree. I will say I also had a master's when I was hired, but I don't know if that would have made a difference really, because I'd had the experience that I'd had, which I think is what really drew the hiring manager at the time. It's because I'd done something that seemed really relevant to the mission work. The second one around a typical workday, this is one of the reasons that philanthropy is such an attractive field for folks who love to be in a knowledge field. Extremely diverse. It's one of the most creative and also frustrating and humbling careers I think you can have, because you really don't have power. It's influence power. It's how do you begin to think about connecting dots? How do you influence with reputation? How do you listen well? And how do you get lucky sometimes that you heard something that you could connect the dot to in another part of a social change environment? When I was at Kellogg in particular, because it's a national foundation, I think I saw every new idea and every new sort of think tank and infographic and social network analysis, all these words that I had no clue what they were. Now I'm ashamed to know that I know most of them. But you actually are in this really rich environment of intellectual stimulation. And a lot of the days are really driven by trying to understand and to think about, are there things that are usable that could actually help amplify or accelerate change? And then a lot of it is just saying, wow, I thought that, and as soon as I saw this, I was completely wrong. And I think those are some of the best projects that I've been in, where I went in with a sense that I had some sort of competence, and I listened and I realized how hard this work is, to Kyle's point before, and how I was actually in a position of both power and responsibility to continue to wear that as well as I could, to know that I didn't really know much, because if we knew a lot, we would have changed things much more rapidly. So I would say every day is a little bit different.
Every day is really different.
I travel quite a bit, so not now, but travel is different, and I wouldn't say there's a typical day for me, other than lots of learning, lots of humility, lots of interactions, and a lot of trying to do better every day.
And as everybody on the call knows, foundations they have a small program staff, but there are lots of other kinds of jobs in foundations, or in HR and in communications and in evaluation. And so there are ways to get into foundations that aren't strictly into programming. I came in, as I said, in communications and then went into programming. So you've got a finance background, there's a whole unit doing that, managing investments in foundations. So there are lots of different kinds of knowledge needed. I just wanted to talk about my best day. So we were moving about $70 million a year. I had a team of about 21 people. So you'd think that every day would be a good day, but it's really hard to move that kind of resource and have it have an impact. But when we got our evaluation about an early childhood program that we'd started in a community, in a neighborhood in Grand Rapids, and actually saw, after a few years of doing this program, that the young children that we we literally created slots, early childhood slots in this community. And when we saw them accelerate past other peers and when they entered kindergarten, that was a really good day for me, because all those investments and all that time trying to figure out how to create early childhood slots in a one of the poorest neighborhoods in Grand Rapids, it paid off. Then those children's now their lives are going to be better, because we know that if you can get a good start, you have a better chance of being successful. So in philanthropy, those were my best days. Kyle, what do you want to throw in? You were going to take a stab at fundraising to Grantmaker, Grantseeker to Grantmaker.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it's a great question, but I'm actually going to turn it on. I'm going to answer it and then turn it on its head. So I've done both. I've been a public grant maker. I've been a fundraiser. Worked in higher education as a fundraiser. I've been inside large private philanthropy, and then now outside again. And one of the things I've noticed in that transition is if you want to make the transition from grant seeker to grant maker, you first have to understand that there's an ecosystem of grant seekers and grant makers. And knowing and reflecting on the power dynamics and reflecting on what you like about either side, and then embrace that and understand it, and then use that to your advantage in either side. So when I was a grant maker, a public grant maker, I learned to listen. I learned to be really thoughtful about investments and approaches. Was very careful to be open and transparent when I could say yes, and open and transparent when I could say no, and be really clear about managing expectations. As a grant seeker, I had to listen. I had to be really careful about how I invest my time in a different organization. Are our missions aligned? Are our approaches aligned? Does it seem like this is a good relationship, good partnership? And then never try to lead with the transaction, always try to lead with the relationship building. And there are roles in philanthropy where you can do both. If you think about a community foundation, they are constantly, the CEOs of community foundations wear both hats all the time. They are public grant makers, so they have to make wise decisions, they have to work with community, they have endowments and investments, the whole grant maker side, but at the same time, they are constantly raising money from donors to build their endowments, to build programming. And so they always have the fundraiser and the grant maker hat on all the time. So even in philanthropy, it's there are roles you can play where you can bring forth both the skill sets of grant maker and grant seeker, fundraiser, foundation staff, and enjoy the mission fulfillment that we've all been talking about.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. We have a question about, and so is any of this advice that we've been so freely dispensing tonight better targeted at people who are early in their career looking to get into foundations, or mid-career? Is there any special advice for either of those sort of stage of career folks?
You know, I would say some of it holds regardless, because I think it's trying to find the right match of passion and skill with a foundation that will provide that kind of opportunity for you. So I think in some ways you may have a more developed, if you're chronologically older, you may have more of a developed sense of what you are really good at, or you may have a technical expertise that you could bring in that is specific, and you may, that may lead you to an organization that has a lot of specialization. I saw a question in here around metrics. Small foundations, really small staffed foundations, tend to have people who are hired that do many things. You wear many hats, you roll up your sleeves, you do almost everything, and I find that actually pretty enjoyable. My personality type. For those who really want to go deep into metrics, those tend to be more valued within organizations that have additional budget. So I would say if you're looking for that, I think there is a lot of opportunity in philanthropy that are looking for ways to measure. I would say I'm skeptical. I'll just be candid about that, because there's a great report, if you're interested, came out of the UK, out of a business school actually a couple of years ago, called A Whole New World of Funding and Commissioning in Complexity. And it challenges a lot of the old norms around compliance and metrics. And it really pushes us to think more contextually around relationships and complexity theory. And so, so I would say that the both and of there is a lot of space for that, and the field of measurement is also in an evolutionary moment around what actually can you measure. But there's a lot of space for that, I think, and it's a really exciting field to go into if you're thinking about learning metrics, information. Again, it's very creative. So those are a couple responses I would have. And before we finally close off, I would like to share my favorite at the end, but one of my favorite days in philanthropy, because I was thinking that's a fun thing to think about.
Hey, Kara, can you type in the name of the report you just mentioned in the chat function? Or just send it to me and I'll make sure it gets out. Yeah. We're closing in here on the last 9 minutes of our time together. It's gone really fast, at least for those of us who've been talking a lot, but the questions are just spectacular. I really appreciate folks taking time to put their thoughts into questions. And I want to give Kyle and Kara both an opportunity to give us any closing thoughts they have. But before we get there, there's a question here about, is it common for people who do fundraising to move to make a career switch into foundations? And in my experience, no, I have a foundation experience of 20 years at one large international private foundation. So it may be more common in community foundations or in other types of foundations. So that's part of the question that Kara or Kyle can address as well. And also wondering, this individual works with high net worth individuals, and wondering if that's a foundation path. Really depends on whether they want to start a foundation. Certainly, I have a lot of friends who run very small, large dollar but small foundations, or maybe go into impact investing or philanthropic investing. Each one of those is a possibility. Depends on what you want to do. So, Karen, Kyle, any thoughts about the fundraising to foundation staff or philanthropic advising, impact investing?
I'll go. The career path piece is philanthropy. It's like real estate: relationship. And when I was running our nonprofit association, I got called into the Mott Foundation every year to give a state of the sector report, and I gave it every year. And out of that, I got my renewal of my operating grant. I came in one time, they kept me in for a good 45 minutes, and the room kept filling up with more and more people. And I kept talking and presenting, and then they sent me back, and I did not get my renewal. And I thought, I've had a 25-year relationship with this foundation, and I'm the guy that blew it, right? Well, I get a call, and they said, that was an interview. We'd like you to hire you. So that is very typical, where a grantee is brought in. Story, right? That's what Allie's laughing at. A grantee is brought in. They know you. They know the organization. They know your work. I think that's more common than coming in from the transactional side of fundraising.
Yeah. Excellent. Kara, anything to add on that point?
I think what you're hearing here, and I think is actually true at a macro level, there's not one direct path into philanthropy. I will say though, for younger staff who want to move into philanthropy, my experience has been, I've only worked in 2, but I've worked with dozens, that if you start in a position, if you want to advance in the position, if you start in an administrative or a more entry-level position, oftentimes in philanthropy, the way that you advance is actually you move to a different foundation. So I do think that's different than if you move up, if you're hired in a programmatic role. I saw another question around program versus operations. There's another report I can type in here as well that came out of FSG, which is there's a whole group of folks who support the sector from sort of think tanks and research, et cetera. But there also is a move to say, how can operations align and be mission-centric instead of program versus operations? So like professors versus non-professors, or doctors versus everybody else within a hospital system. There really is a move around equity and trying to figure out how do you position everything as mission oriented to advance impact. So FSG did a report called Being the Change, BEING, Being the Change. It also came out, I think, in maybe 2018, early 2018. But the other ones are very technical functions, so it's much easier to move from adjacent career in communications or HR or finance or accounting if you want to be utilizing your skills within a mission-oriented organization. Those jobs are much more, those turnover more than program jobs because of, for a couple reasons. Kyle was saying it takes so long for change to start to happen. So it takes a lot of time to do that. And there are fewer of those positions historically. And once you specialize and your network gets pretty strong, that becomes a real powerful influence strategy around social change that it's hard to do that in really short bursts and most of the kinds of problems that we work on.
Are the wicked ones, are the really tough ones. I just want to hit network because that's what if you're in a position and you're applying for a position, a foundation position, you need to sell who you know. There's a question here from someone who works in a national environmental organization. One of the reasons I was hired by Kellogg after that pitch, oh, by the way, the Nature Conservancy did get their $2 million. So the pitch went pretty well, but it was because I had a USDA network, I had an environmental network, and I had a rural development network, and I could bring those networks to bear. As Kara was saying, she had a very robust, and Kyle as well, civic engagement and civic participation network and national service. So think about your networks and what you're offering, because it's not just you, it's all those people that you know and have worked with that the foundation will be looking for as you're hiring, as you're hopefully being hired into these positions. So we just have a couple more minutes. Last points of brilliance, team, that you'd like to offer folks as they think about a career in philanthropy, specifically in a foundation?
I want to just end with my, one thing that I was so moved by, just because I think it's why we do the hard work, which it's highly relational, it's complicated, it's not linear, it's frustrating, it's competitive. Philanthropy and social change is competitive as well, all those things. I was working as a director in New Mexico at the 100-year mark of statehood. New Mexico, for those of you who are tracking it now, particularly Navajo Nation, is just struggling with all of the reasons that we're talking about in terms of inequity, lack of resources, health, pre-existing conditions, everything that sort of creates the context that residents and tribal members are dealing with today. At the 100-year mark of the statehood of New Mexico, we were asked at the Kellogg Foundation to sponsor the first gathering of a look back on sovereignty for pueblos in New Mexico. And we were able to fund 400 community members coming from each pueblo in New Mexico to come together at a tribally owned hotel in the middle of the state. And elders and young people gathered and started to take a deep look at who they were, why they had ended up historically in the situation they were in, and what they wanted for their future. That was one of the most beautiful, most powerful moments of my career, where you heard organizations and leaders talk about all of the issues in a very deep way around tribal membership, domestic violence, innovation, core values. And they invited me in as a member of the community because we had built enough of a relationship and trust that I felt I was in part of this intimate gathering of folks. And it was something that would not have happened without private philanthropy and years of investment and listening. And that, I know, made a difference in terms of how there's so much work that came out of that big moment for Pueblo people that would not have happened had it not been for philanthropy. And so we always try to think on the team that I worked on, would this happen without us? And if it would, let it happen. How do we add value? And it was, I can get emotional thinking about it because it was something that philanthropy could uniquely do. And it's made a difference.
Yeah, thank you, Kara. That's a great note to end on. It truly is a wonderful field to work in. And good luck to all the job seekers. Stay connected to the nonprofit management program. They've got lots of really interesting programs coming up. And I know you'll stay connected to your classmates and each other in these troubling times. So Kyle, thank you so much for joining us. Kara, it's been wonderful. And I look forward to seeing both of you in the real when we get back out there, and to seeing, I hope, some of you who are on this call tonight in my class next fall. So thanks a million, everybody. Take care and have a great evening.